Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Waiting game. Brent crude tumbles as President Trump sets a 2-week deadline to make a decision on Iran.
I have a message directly from the president, and I quote, "Based on the fact that there's a substantial chance of negotiations that may or may not take place with Iran in the near future, I will make my decision whether or not to go within the next 2 weeks."
And Israel steps up its strikes after Iranian missiles hit a hospital in southern Israel on Thursday. And we'll speak to MacCarley, retired U.S. Army Major General, about what U.S. involvement in the conflict could mean. It's just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Johanna Bersachi in Dubai. Well, it's been a week of this now. The war continues between Iran and Israel over the last couple of days. For any of our U.S. viewers who are out yesterday, there was a big story suggesting that the U.S. military involvement was imminent. But of course, we found out overnight that President Trump is now saying that he will make a decision within the next 2 weeks, giving diplomacy a chance. So there you have it for risky assets, breathing a bit of a sigh of relief. As you can see, though, behind me, S&P futures back from holiday, so down 0.2% as we gear up into the U.S. Open. Not done a whole lot, but I should say over the course of the week, though, we are down about 0.7%. So marginally weaker. I wouldn't say substantially weaker versus, say, some of the local indices. We'll get to there in a moment. 10-year yields in the U.S. also sitting just shy of 4.4, so 4.38 is where we're at. Again, trading sideways as we come back into trading. Brent just shy of $77. Substantial move lower today, down 2.4%. And again, perhaps some of that geopolitical risk premium is being taken out after Trump's comments suggesting that he hasn't made his decision yet. And then gold pulling back as well from close to record highs, down 0.5% this morning. But let's flip the board, because I did just mention that it's been a full 7 days now since the initial Israel attack on Iran. And this is the picture for some of the local markets. Take a look. The Tadawul in Saudi Arabia down 2%. You've got the Abu Dhabi index, ADX, down 1.5%. The worst performing index in the region is the Egyptian index, the EGX, down 7%, led by some financials. But then take a look at the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. It's actually up 5% over the course of this week. And if you take a look at some of the member weightings, the rankings, the reason that is the case is because the insurers have done pretty well over the course of the last few days, especially with some of the infrastructure damage that Iran has managed to level on certain areas within the country. So that is the performance of these local markets. Tel Aviv, the only index in the region that is positive over the last 7 days. Okay, let's also check in on how markets in Asia are faring today. Avril Hong is in our Singapore studio. Avril.
Yeah, Joanna, we're seeing Asia stocks fairly resilient, which is quite remarkable given these uncertainties. As our MLive colleague Garfield Reynolds has been highlighting, maybe in such times, investors don't like markets with stretched valuations. And valuations in Asia are looking attractive. And you look at the region's benchmark, it has been outperforming US stocks this year. So we're seeing gains in China, gains in South Korea as well. The outperformance in South Korea might be to do with the optimism surrounding corporate governance reforms as well as AI stocks. We are also keeping an eye on the Japanese currency, where we're seeing it firming a little against the greenback, but still at relatively weak levels. We had Japan inflation accelerating to the highest in 2 years. But of course, the moves on the yen are related to what we're seeing in the dollar, and given this 2-week window that we're hearing about. Jomana.
Most definitely, that is driving sentiment this morning. Avril Hong in Singapore, thank you. Well, speaking of, President Trump says he is putting off U.S. action on Iran for now. The White House says he will decide within 2 weeks whether to attack, adding that his goal remains halting uranium enrichment and he remains open to diplomacy if possible. The 2-week negotiating window marks a step back from Trump's run of tough rhetoric, which included warnings for all residents of Tehran to evacuate. Bloomberg earlier reported that senior U.S. officials had been preparing for the possibility of a strike on Iran as soon as this weekend. Joining us now in Jerusalem is Bloomberg's Dan Williams. Dan, safely back in Jerusalem, I see. Let me just ask you about the latest, which is that President Trump seems to be opening a window, a door to the diplomatic channels, and says that he has not made a final decision on whether to get involved in this war militarily, essentially buying about 2 weeks of time before we know exactly what the U.S. are going to do.
Yes, I think you're exactly right. I don't think his initial instinct or his basic instinct is to go to war. In fact, he returned to power on the promise of withdrawing the United States or ending endless wars, needless wars, as he would see them. So I think his first choice, his first preference would be for a diplomatic deal. Of course, his terms for a diplomatic deal so far are not terms the Iranians have accepted. And perhaps he sees the coming 2 weeks with sustained Israeli military pressure as the time in which Iran will do a review and perhaps decide to climb down from its refusal to give up its uranium enrichment. That really is at the heart of this diplomatic dispute. Now, it's also worth remembering the phrasing within 2 weeks actually gives a very hazy timeline. Essentially, he can make a decision a minute from now. He can make a decision 2 weeks from now. And if it's 2 weeks from now, that takes us up against the July 4th holiday, Independence Day in the United States, perhaps a time when he would want to hold up a successful U.S. military offensive, military intervention in Iran as part of his administration's success. So it's very hard to know if there's also a tactical haze here, a sense that he might be wanting to, again, lower the guard of the Iranians for an eventual U.S. intervention militarily, if that happens.
Dan, thank you so much for the overview. Bloomberg's Dan Williams in Jerusalem today. Thank you. Now, joining us now is Mark MacCarley, U.S. Army retired Major General. Major General, it's really good to have you with us on the show. What do you make of this ambiguity around what the U.S. are going to be doing? Is there a precedent for this in history? Have we ever been in a situation where it's this unclear whether the U.S. is going to get involved militarily in a conflict or not?
Oh, I think there have been multiple occasions when the U.S. has been hesitant about entering into armed conflict. All I have to do is jump back 85 years at the time of Pearl Harbor. And just immediately before that, while President Roosevelt was focused on assisting the United Kingdom and whatever was left of the Allies against Nazi Germany, by the same token, he did not take action for years. It was only the event, the Pearl Harbor attack by the Japanese, that forced him to make the decision to go to war. So hesitation as a tool has been used repeatedly. And I just want to indicate that there's no statute or directive from any governmental agency that says that that 2 weeks cannot be extended further. It's an opportunity to put pressure if, in fact, there is even a hint of a possibility, a probability that this whole matter can be resolved through negotiation. Great. If it takes 2 weeks, fine. If it takes longer, but you have a real deal, then that extra expenditure of time is worthwhile. But just caveating the extra time, we have to be very careful what we wish for. Certainly none of us, especially those who have served in the armed forces of the United States and around the world, nobody, unless they're an absolute sociopath, is interested in going to war. It's a bloodletting, it's a loss of life, and certainly all focus should be on peace. But by the same token, when you look at the situation in Iran, and if somehow we made a deal or we simply declared a ceasefire, then the biggest question that will be put before not only those in Israel who have a direct interest in this conflict, they initiated at least the salvos against the Iranian nuclear capability, but even over here is, what's this end going to look like? What is the end state?
Yeah.
And we could go into that. I know you've got a few more questions, and I have a few more answers regarding that issue of end state.
So, okay, so let me just tell you about perhaps the ability to extend that timeline. What do you think would be the catalyst for the U.S., for President Trump, to decide to get involved in this war? Because so far, the Iranian response has been specifically targeting Israel. It's been bilateral. U.S. assets, GCC infrastructure, all of that being spared. They haven't gone for the option of disruption on Strait of Hormuz. What would need to happen, do you think, for President Trump to say, actually, I'm going to pull the trigger here?
Well, if we listen carefully to what the president has stated, if there is no progress, now again, I have to revert to this conversation about 2 weeks, but if there is no tangible, palpable, we can feel it, we can understand it, progress in these talks. There was no progress, by the way, in the first 60 days, but if there is no intent, verifiable intent, shown to the U.S., to U.S. allies, to people around the world that Iran is, in fact, intent upon resolving this crisis and, most importantly, intent upon giving up its nuclear capability, surrendering that capability, and demolishing all the infrastructure that was built up for the purpose of both enrichment and perhaps weaponization of that uranium.
Okay, so the past week, all of us have had to read up about these bunker buster bombs, the MOBs, because those seem to be the only munitions that can actually penetrate the nuclear facility in Fordo. But let's say the U.S. do get militarily involved and they use those MOBs. What is the guarantee that that actually is going to completely eliminate Iran's nuclear stockpile and their nuclear program? They may have other secret stockpiles, and you're also not eliminating the knowledge and the know-how that exists on the ground. There's no guarantee that sending across several MOBs is going to solve the situation.
I could incorporate your statement as my answer. But just in terms of the use of those GBU-57s, what we call the bunker bombs, certainly we've touted these bombs across social media and in the networks that are monitoring what's taking place in the Middle East. Yes, the U.S. has these bunker buster bombs, and there's also almost an implied thought process that all that needs to be done to complete Israel's elimination of Iranian nuclear capabilities to drop one of these bunker bombs right into Fordo. But as you've suggested, there has been no positive test to demonstrate that those GBU-57s, the bunker bombs, can indeed reach to levels that we suspect house at 300 feet or more, that house some of the most critical of Iranian infrastructure. That's problem number one. And when you think about it, if we drop those bombs, let's just say we went to war, we decided to attack tonight, which was a possibility up until a few hours ago, by tomorrow morning, we might have a big crater, but that crater might have done nothing more than raise up about 200 feet of dirt. So we just don't know even about the capability of these, quote, miracle bombs. And then further, as you've suggested, we just don't know all the locations and all those, not only the premier scientists, some of whom have been eliminated, but we just don't know where they all are.
Yeah. Okay, we've talked about what the U.S. could possibly do on the offensive side of things. What about defense capabilities? What can the U.S. military do right now to be prepped in case U.S. assets in the region are targeted?
This almost goes back to the time when I was in uniform, because the whole concern, once again, was Iran even 10, 15 years ago, because Iran at that time was building up its ballistic missile capability. And especially when we look at the Emirates, Emirates were vulnerable at that time, and the U.S. Put significant effort and money. Of course, the Emirates paid for a lot of this in terms of putting missile defense systems in that part of the world, so that there is sufficient coverage that if Iran launches, there's a high probability that U.S. ground-based, for instance, Patriots, and naval-based, they call standard missiles, would have the ability to shoot down most of what Iran shoots at us. Is it absolutely fail-safe? Well, that's an easy question right now, because even though the Israelis have shown significant success with Iron Dome, And let's caveat that Iron Dome is also a joint sort of venture with the United States. We've still had in the last couple of days a good number of Iranian attacks, successful attacks, where there's missiles, these swarming missiles. Some of them get past Iron Dome and do significant damage on the ground. So we just have to be prepared for that. But be prepared, as I raise my finger, is critical. Be prepared to accept the fact that if we jump into this engagement, let's just say tonight, we drop that GBU-57, those bunker bombs, and then the next day we begin to see American service members killed, whether they are the ones who participated in the aerial delivery of these systems, if not missile launched, or they happen to be located in the myriad of U.S. facilities in the Middle East. I don't know if the American people are yet prepared to see those body bags. And that's a question that ultimately will have to be addressed by the president to the American people.
Yeah. Mark MacCarley, U.S. Army retired Major General, thank you so much for coming on our show. We really appreciate your insight this morning. Really timely. Now, still ahead, hear why Anand Rathi Wealth expects higher inflation as President Trump weighs whether to join Israel in its conflict with Iran. This is Bloomberg.
I'm David Weston. Join me for the next generation of Wall Street Week. This week, Vlad Tenev of Robinhood takes us into the wild world of mathematical superintelligence. We go to Saudi Arabia for the story of Aramco's plan to help wean the kingdom off of oil.
We think of ourselves as a technology company delivering energy. We are very pragmatic here in the kingdom.
And Larry Summers dissects the Fed's latest decision. Watch the all-new Wall Street Week. More than what you need to know, it's what you need to think about.
Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Versace in Dubai. U.S. equity futures moderated declines as President Trump weighs whether to offer Israel military backing in its conflict with Iran. For the week, these indices are tracking weaker, but only marginally so. The S&P down about 0.7%. Joining us now is Feroze Azeez, joint CEO at Anand Rathi Wealth. You know, something I noticed this week when I was taking a look back at the weekly performance of stock market indices was that Liberation Day was a much bigger threat to global markets than U.S. getting militarily involved in a hot war in the Middle East. Interesting.
Absolutely, very interesting. But if you look at how the market from the derivative side is shaping up, if you look at the S&P 500's option chain, you realize that the market is expecting a reasonable swing. That's indicated by the skew of the implied walls of the options which are not at the money.
Yeah.
So
are people buying downside risk or upside risk?
Yes. So what happens is if the options 10% out of the money on both sides are priced at a higher implied wall, that implies that there could be a larger swing possible. So the skew is indicating the volatility is ahead rather than currently there.
Yeah, I get that. But in terms of positioning, does the option market imply that traders are more inclined to position for a bearish pullback in the S&P? Because if you look at the performance, actually, since May, it's done nothing but steadily climb back up again.
Yes. So if you see the skew numbers with the forward rates, the forward rate, now if you look at the Fed rate, is 4.25 to 4.5. The forward rate is nothing but the rate at which you can roll over your positions to the subsequent expiry. The forward rates are showing up a higher forward rate with a larger skew. If this combination is there, there's gravity towards the higher side rather than the lower side.
Interesting. So how do you piece together, let me just bring in the macro into the equation, what is happening on the ground with the U.S. economy, the latest FOMC meeting, the fact that the FOMC or the Fed are still in wait-and-see mode, versus some of the option signals that you're getting from these equity markets?
If you look at the total economy as a whole, if you look at the GDP growth, 1.4, percent for the last year, 2025. That combined with a 6.2% fiscal deficit, the yields don't seem to be coming down. If you look at the yield curve of the US, it's a very interesting yield curve. You look at 2-year yields are at 3.9. The 30-year yield is at 4.8. The 2-3 months yield is at 4.3. That implies that there's demand for a 2-year and a 3-year Fed paper. But as you go the longer end, people are worried because the $36 trillion debt deficit, which has reached 1.24% of the GDP, 1.24 times the GDP, is one of the highest over the last 5 years.
So people are positioning in steepeners. Do you like those trades as well?
See, I would rather play the yield curve going long on the bonds, which are the 10-year bonds, and go short on the 2-year bonds.
Okay, so anti-consensus.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so taking advantage of that. Is it because you think that positioning has got extreme, or is it because fundamentally you think people are overshooting concerns around the size of the U.S. fiscal deficit?
So the spread between the 10-year paper and the Fed 2-year paper, which is currently at about almost 45 bips, is one of the highest over the last 10, 12 years. So I would rather bet for this getting to be squeezed back to the average of 22 rather than 45.
How do you think about the theme of U.S. exceptionalism? It got tested during that bumpy month after Liberation Day or Tariff Liberation Day, but money is going back into the U.S. again. Do you think that thesis is going to be intact towards the end of the year?
I think it will be intact, but not to the extent which it needs to be with that kind of debt rates in the US. Now, if you look at India, where I come from, I'm based out of Mumbai, FIIs have sold out India to almost about 4 trillion rupees over the last year and a quarter. And they've taken back money, most of it back to the US. If that's happened, I would say another couple of $2 trillion is more expected, but I think most of the outflow from the emerging markets is behind us.
Interesting. Okay, so are you optimistic on the outlook for Indian markets here?
I'm very, very optimistic. The 2-3 reasons why I'm very optimistic is not just the earnings growth. Last year was not a great. We tracked the financial year ends, which is March. The growth in the Nifty, which is the largest index in India, which represents almost 70% of the Indian market cap, grew by about 8.7% was the earnings growth. It was a bad year with 8.7%. Now, that's the context of how earnings growth is looked at in India. Now, if you look at what is happening in India is Indian household savings, only 6.7% of that is in equities. See, all the emerging markets have already taken the benefit of their own population investing in their equities. 6.7% is a very, very small number. And that's actually expediting like how. So last year, we had 6 trillion rupees coming in from the domestic retail, the lower strata, because we are high population, demographic dividends are very high. So I would expect Indian markets being extremely supported with domestic liquidity, absorbing the geopolitical uncertainty.
So interesting. I did not know that about domestic ownership of equities, but I'm going to remember it for the next chat. Thank you so much for coming on our show. Feroze Azeez, Joint CEO at Anand Rathi Wealth. Now for a look at some of the other stories we're following today. Santos' board agreed this week to back a $19 billion takeover bid from a group led by ADNOC. It is one of the biggest foreign takeovers in Australian history. Will force regulators and politicians to weigh who controls critical energy infrastructure against the need to address a looming domestic gas shortfall. Somalia will begin trading equities and government-issued Sukuk bonds on a new exchange early next year. The National Securities Exchange of Somalia will target listings from companies in telecommunications, banking, real estate, energy, and agriculture to drive economic growth in the country. It also plans to tap cross-listings with exchanges in Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda. DR Congo's biggest lender, Rawbank, has reported a full-year profit increase of 11% as a flourishing copper industry boosted its performance. The Kinshasa-based lender's after-tax profit climbed $212 million in the year through December from $191 million in the prior period. Congo is the world's second biggest copper producer and is benefiting from a price rally following a sharp plunge in global stockpiles. And a look at equity futures. This is where we're at right now. S&P and NASDAQ coming back online again and leaning towards the red towards the end of this very eventful week, not just in terms of geopolitics, but also in terms of U.S. data that's come through and that Fed meeting. But net, we're down about 0.7% for the week. And take a look at European markets, up 0.8%. Some of the optimism coming through around the potential for a diplomatic breakthrough in the region. Now, coming up more on that conflict in the region, we speak to former senior MENA director at the U.S. National Security Council, Prem Kumar. That is coming up next. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Waiting game. Brent crude tumbles as President Trump sets a 2-week deadline to make a decision on Iran.
I have a message directly from the president, and I quote, "Based on the fact that there's a substantial chance of negotiations that may or may not take place with Iran in the near future, I will make my decision whether or not to go within the next 2 weeks."
Israel steps up its strikes after Iranian missiles hit a hospital in southern Israel on Thursday. And we'll be speaking to former U.S. National Security Council Senior MENA Director Prem Kumar and Control Risk Senior Analyst Aniseh Bassiri Tabrizi about the war, diplomacy efforts, and regime change. All of that is coming up in the next half hour. It's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Joanna Bersachi in Dubai. So a bit of breathing space this morning versus where we were, say, 24 hours ago when it sounded like U.S. military intervention was going to happen imminently. Now we've got up to potentially a 2-week window for the U.S. president to decide what to do. So on the back of that, we're seeing a marginal pullback in U.S. equities. S&P futures down 0.2%. Though, as you can see, major tumble in the price of oil today. Brent pulling back 2% as some of the geopolitical risk premium gets priced out there. 10-year yields not doing a whole lot, 4.39. Of course, we did have that FOMC meeting this week, keeping the interest rate cuts that were penciled in intact, but also massively upgrading their inflation forecast for this year. So the net result on U.S. Treasuries, as you can see, is marginally higher throughout the course of the last couple of days. And then gold pulling back from those all-time highs, down 0.4% this morning. Let's switch over. I just want to take a 1-week look back at how some of the local equity markets have been performing. The war between Israel and Iran, the direct war, I should say, has been going on for 7 days now, just over a week. This is the performance of the various indices in the region throughout the course of this week. Tadawul in Saudi Arabia down 2%. You've got the Abu Dhabi index, ADX, down 1.5%. Egypt, the worst performing local index, down 7%. Some of the financial names getting hit there. But then take a look at the Tel Aviv index. It's actually up 5.2%, and that is namely on back of the outperformance of insurers that are trading within the Tel Aviv index. And this has been the case because several of those ballistic missiles that were fired towards Israel managed to break through the air defense system and cause serious damage. So on the back of that, which is one of these side effects of war, obviously the insurers have had a good run this week. So this is the picture for the local indices over the course of the last 7 days. All right, let's also check in on how markets in Asia are faring. Avril is in our Singapore studio. Quite a lot of, well, a mixed, I'd say, handover coming from Asia today, Avril.
Yeah, mixed in stocks. We're seeing some firmness when it comes to Chinese and South Korean equities, but I also thought I'd just highlight what we're seeing in the FX space. It's been interesting this week because the dollar has been facing this bearish consensus so far this year, but it faced a bit of a test, and that was because of the Middle East tensions, of course. We're seeing a bit of a slump at the moment on the greenback, given Trump's comments and potentially us seeing this 2-week window. So that's helping Asia FX to snap a 3-session losing streak. Note as well that when it comes to Asia FX, currencies that are from economies that are net importers of crude, they're likely to remain under pressure. But what's also interesting was today how the PBOC set the fix relatively strong. The dollar-yuan fix below 717. This was for the first time since March. So it speaks to this vote of confidence from the Chinese central bank of the renminbi, relative strength there, and also perhaps for other Asia currencies, which is interesting to see given these uncertainties. Jumana.
Ava Hong in Singapore, thank you so much. Now, former Egyptian Foreign Minister Nabil Fahmy says U.S. involvement in the conflict between Israel and Iran could be very dangerous. He told us world leaders should choose diplomacy over force.
5 of the Security Council have a responsibility to play a leading role in diplomacy. So that will include UK and France, but also the US, Russia, and China. But if somebody has an initiative, I welcome that initiative. If it comes up with some concrete, tangible results or pathways, it should help the US choose the diplomatic trend rather than trying to push the military one.
Let's bring in Prem Kumar, partner at DGA-Albright Stonebridge Group and former senior MENA director at the U.S. National Security Council. Really good to have you with us. I know you worked closely with the Obama administration, and I'm sure there were many episodes during your time, and during Obama's time in office, where military intervention was possibly on the cards, or at least the potential of being drawn in to another conflict in the Middle East was also on the cards as well. What are some of the options President Trump would be taking into consideration now, given this fraught political climate and given the ambiguity of the messaging that's coming from the White House?
Well, thanks, Jumana. I think there are two main options, obviously. The first is whether to use force at all. And that could take a number of different forms, whether the U.S. chooses to bomb the Fordo enrichment facility with the bunker-busting massive ordnance penetrator, whether it supports the Israelis in trying to do so. They have certain options available to them, including potentially commando raids on the ground or repeated strikes with lower yield munitions. And then, of course, there are the diplomatic options, including the idea of a regional consortium in which Iran could enrich uranium together with the Saudis or the Emiratis, as well as potentially other ideas for changing the horizon under which Iran could enrich and at what level. So one of the options is getting involved militarily in the war, but there are different ways the U.S. can get involved militarily. If they opt to go for, say, a targeted strike on the Fordo nuclear facility, do you think that then they run a real risk of getting drawn into a longer, more protracted and a lot more dangerous war, given some of the comments that have come through from the Iranian senior leadership the last few days? I think that's always a risk, and I'm sure that that's weighing on President Trump's mind. The first question is whether the strike would succeed. Mm-hmm. You know, we haven't actually used the massive ordnance penetrator in other situations. So while it was designed for situations like this, it's not clear that it would completely destroy the Fordo plant. And if we aren't able to completely destroy it, then it sort of invites the question of why this strike took place in the first place. Second is the risk that the Iranians reconstitute their nuclear program in other facilities completely away from international inspections. And then, of course, the last risk is, or one of the other risks, is that Iran retaliates in some form against U.S. interests or U.S. allies. Yeah. So the diplomatic channel has now been reopened. We know that the Iranian foreign minister actually is meeting with European foreign ministers today in Geneva. What sort of knock-on effect is that going to have to the U.S.? It doesn't matter if European foreign ministers are actually meeting with the Iranian foreign ministers. Since when has the U.S. actually listened to what their European counterparts are saying? I think it will have an effect. There are some reports that Steve Witkoff might try to join some of those conversations. We'll see if that takes place. But I think the Europeans understand the gravity of the situation, and they're going to be pressing the Iranians for some path to de-escalate, whether that is in giving firm commitments that they accept that there wouldn't be enrichment on Iranian soil, even if perhaps their right to enrich under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was respected. So there are, I think, a variety of different ways that the Iranians could convey that they're serious about a diplomatic solution that the Europeans could help to transmit to Washington. Yeah. How bad would it be if Iran decided to leave the NPT and leave that non-proliferation treaty? They said they haven't made a final decision, but of course, if their backs are against the wall, they could go down that route. Yes, they could, and that would remove much of the legal pretext for the international community's concerns about Iran's nuclear program, because obviously many countries, Israel included, that never signed the NPT, were free to enrich uranium as they please. If Iran were to withdraw from the NPT, it also means that the international visibility into Iran's nuclear program would probably come to an end or be severely limited. So that would be a significant risk.
Yeah. My colleague Sam Dahi put up a piece yesterday about the Arab states and the fact that the speed of the attack took them by surprise. Obviously, the Israeli Prime Minister has been talking about the potential for military action for a long time now, but then obviously this has all unfolded very, very quickly. There's major concern in the region that this could escalate into something bigger. How do you read how the Arab states, the Gulf states, are positioning themselves for what could happen next, especially because it wasn't that long ago that President Trump was in the region talking about a new dawn and a new Middle East and the economic transformation?
Right. I think the Arab states want stability above all, and they've made that clear to both the Israelis and to the U.S. and also to the Iranians. And while I personally think that the risk of Iranian retaliation against the UAE, Saudi Arabia, is quite low, the risk of an unintended escalation, is still present. That if the U.S. gets involved and the Iranians decide to retaliate against U.S. military bases in the Gulf, that could eventually drag in the Gulf Arab states.
Yeah. What is the best case scenario from here?
I think the best case scenario is a deal.
Nuclear deal?
Yes. Between.
Would it be that different from the JCPOA?
It would have some similarities. I think Iran would be able to enrich uranium at certain levels for a certain period of time until there was an off-ramp. For example, this regional consortium idea is one. I doubt that they're going to abandon their entire nuclear program overnight. But I think some diplomatic solution to avert this conflict is in everyone's interest.
Yeah, really good to have you on. Excellent perspectives. Prem Kumar, partner at DGA-Albright Stonebridge Group and former senior MENA director at the U.S. National Security Council under the Obama administration. Now, coming up, Gulf states are carefully assessing the impact of war between Israel and Iran. As we were just talking about, we speak to a senior analyst at Control Risk on what the conflict means for the region and beyond. This is Bloomberg.
I'm David Weston. Join me for the next generation of Wall Street Week. This week, Vlad Tenev of Robinhood takes us into the wild world of mathematical superintelligence. We go to Saudi Arabia for the story of Aramco's plan to help wean the kingdom off of oil.
We think of ourselves as a technology company delivering energy. We are very pragmatic here in the kingdom.
And Larry Summers dissects the Fed's latest decision. Watch the all-new Wall Street Week. More than what you need to know, it's what you need to think about.
Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Joanna Bersace in Dubai. Gulf states are now assessing the impact of the war between Israel and Iran, including the risks to their oil infrastructure and economic development plans. Gulf leaders are also assessing the possibility of the Islamic Republic's clerical regime falling. I spoke to former Egyptian Foreign Minister Nabil Fahmy about this exact topic.
I don't know where regime change has actually worked before. And I would argue that even when it happened before, in Iran itself, by America over 50 years ago, the ultimate result was the regime went more towards an anti-American perspective than a positive one. So let regime change be an expression of domestic politics rather than that of foreign politics.
Strong lines there. Joining us now is Aniseh Bassiri Tabrizi, senior analyst at Control Risk. Good to have you with us. There's a lot to get through, but maybe let's just start with the news of the day, which is that it looks as though President Trump is now buying time on making a decision on whether to get involved militarily in this conflict. Do you see there being a serious chance for a diplomatic breakthrough in the next couple of weeks?
Well, thanks for having me first, Giovanna. I think what is interesting is that we are seeing the first de-escalation moment since the conflict started now more than a week ago on the 13th of June. We know that Iran is meeting the E3 foreign ministers in Geneva today. I think the words from President Trump are signaling there is at least some consideration of diplomacy for the first time since the conflict started. Whether that means that there is a reconsideration on whether the U.S. will even get involved in the conflict, I think it's too soon to say. There are mixed signals coming out of the White House, so I think it's unclear whether this is still on the table. For the time being, I think we are 50-50 chance for either option. But I think it's promising that at least diplomacy is now back on the table.
Yeah, okay. So, we're going to have lots of conversations today about diplomacy, I'm sure, as we get into the European hour, especially because the meeting is happening in Geneva. But this is diplomacy as it pertains to U.S. and Iran. What about Israel and Iran? What happens in the absence of U.S. military intervention? When does Israel stop?
Well, this, I think it's not clear. I think at the beginning of the operation, it seemed that the operation was intending to basically weaken the Iranian nuclear capability and the offensive capability, in particular the ballistic missiles. But over the past few days, the targets have expanded with some targeting on the oil and gas sites, the production ones, not the export ones, and some of the, say, for instance, a state TV station, some that are not directly linked to military or nuclear sites. I think at the moment it seems that the focus is still on that and that there is no intentional regime change agenda. But at the same time, we have seen, for instance, a cyber strike at the Iranian state TV with images demonstrating people pouring into the street and calling for people to rise against the regime. We see the name of the operation, Operation Rising Lion, which is a reference to the flag of those who support the monarchy. So I think, again, it's unclear whether the military successes on the nuclear and on the ballistic missile front might have changed the goalposts for Israel, whether the intervention or not of the U.S. also will affect the decision from the Israeli side on when to stop. But I think one thing is clear from the Israeli side: without attacking Fordo, this military operation is not going to be considered concluded.
Yeah, and that is the risk, right? And I just wonder if Iran do end up signing on to a renewed U.S. deal, a U.S. nuclear deal, can Israel still deem the offense and the campaign against Iran a success in the absence of being able to penetrate that Fordo nuclear facility? Even though, of course, we know that just in 1 week, they have managed to gain a lot of military superiority. They have managed to take out a lot of the air defense systems, their ballistic weapons. But in the absence of actually getting access to that nuclear facility, how will Prime Minister Netanyahu get the off-ramp that he needs to deem this a success?
It's an excellent question, and I think there are a lot of connected questions there. For instance, we know that Iran might have transferred some of its nuclear capability and enriched uranium elsewhere in locations that have not been struck or identified yet. We know that Iran might be even more inclined, for instance, to move towards a weaponized nuclear program now that it has seen the weaknesses of its axis of resistance strategy, of its deterrence through ballistic missiles and drone. I think these are all questions that are still lingering. It's unclear what a deal with the U.S., between the U.S. and Iran, would look like. But I think it would need to address some of the security issues, security guarantees that Iran might have. Otherwise, I don't think it's likely that Iran is going to abandon its nuclear ambition, its nuclear capability, and it might be postponed. It obviously is going to be delayed compared to where it was because of the destruction that has undertaken on several nuclear facilities. But I think the decision to move towards that direction, it's going to remain there.
Very useful. Aniseh Bassiri Tabrizi, Control Risk Senior Analyst. Thank you for joining us today. Coming up, Kenyan lawmakers rebuff new proposals on tax breaks. We'll look at the impact next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Johanna Versace in Dubai. Kenyan lawmakers have turned down a Treasury Department proposal to scrap tax breaks on a range of goods and services, citing concerns over inflation and dwindling investor confidence. They remain wary about tax changes after the government's push last year for more revenue sparked deadly protests. Feroze Azeez is our chief Africa correspondent. Jen, walk us through exactly what the National Assembly vetoed and why they vetoed it.
Yeah, Jumana, this is significant, especially if you take a look at the context of what we've seen from Kenya over the past year. So as you were just mentioning there, we heard from lawmakers rejecting proposals by the Treasury to eliminate tax breaks. And the tax breaks were on various goods and services. If we take a look at some of them, from mobile phones to electric buses and bicycles, there was also a removal proposal on preferential corporate income tax rate for local vehicle assemblers and affordable housing builders. So this is significant again for a number of reasons. If we take a look at what happened in Kenya last year, we saw deadly protests that claimed the lives of at least 60 people after much of it was around some of the proposals again for tax increases in a country that is already struggling with its own cost of living issues and also inflation. And so it seems like lawmakers are not wanting a repeat of that from those pictures that we're seeing there from last year. And what we actually heard in particular from the lawmakers is that they want consistent tax policy to enable investors to make informed long-term decisions without the disruption of frequent legislative changes. But still, again, this is an economy that does need to find some way of shoring up some revenue, especially because they abandoned their IMF program earlier in March. And so they really are in an economic situation here where they need to figure out how to move forward. But at this point right now, lawmakers not seeming like they want to eliminate at least tax breaks and put that burden on consumers at this point in time.
Yeah, and let's talk about corruption in Kenya. IMF team has just landed in Kenya to assess the corruption hurdles. How serious of a problem is that?
This again ties to the bigger, broader issue that we're seeing in Kenya. Kenya ranks at 121 of 180 countries globally on a corruption index. And again, part of the issues that we did hear from many protesters last year is that they were concerned that President Ruto, who campaigned on wanting to crack down on corruption, had not been able to do that. We've also heard issues and concerns from human rights groups about corruption within the police force and other forms of government. And so this IMF team is now in the country to try and assess where potentially the country stands and what can be done or instituted in order for them to move forward. And this is not just an exercise where they are trying to figure out broadly where they're at. This is also, again, part of Kenya's hopeful, hopefully they want to get to a point where they can get back into an IMF program, but they need to tackle some of these issues that the fund sees as key.
Jen, thank you so much. Feroze Azeez, our Chief Africa Correspondent in Johannesburg. And for more stories like this from the continent, be sure to subscribe to the Next Africa newsletter on the terminal and our website and our podcast that's available wherever you get your podcasts. That's it for our show. This is Bloomberg.